Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're venturing into a world that operates, well, often beyond the headlines.
Hmm.
We're exploring the intricate and, let's be honest, often brutal reality of Barrio Azteca.
Yeah, it's a Mexican-American gang, street and prison gang, really, and its story, it stretches all the way from U.S. prisons right into the heart of the Mexican drug trade.
Exactly. And we've pulled together quite a range of sources for this. Government reports, academic stuff, news articles, the usual mix. We want to really try and get under the skin of this organization.
Right. Our goal here is basically to dissect the core of Barrio Azteca. Where did it come from? Where does it operate? What kind of activities are we talking about?
And crucially, how it fits into that bigger, really complex picture of organized crime along the U.S. Mexico border.
Precisely.
So let's start at the beginning then. Barrio Azteca didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, definitely not.
Our sources point to it taking root back in the early 1980s, inside prison, actually, the
Yeah.
Caulfield unit in Texas.
Yeah, Jose Raulio Rivera, an inmate from El Paso, he's the guy credited with sort of getting it started.
It officially kicked off, became a thing, in 1986, also in El Paso.
Right. So born inside prison walls, but it grew fast from just a local street and prison gang into something much bigger, a transnational criminal group.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how prisons can sometimes act as, well, incubators for this kind of thing.
It really is. You've got these built-in hierarchies, the need for protection. It kind of mirrors street gangs already. So the jump to a more organized criminal structure isn't always that big a leap for some inmates. Plus, that shared experience, being incarcerated together, it forges really strong bonds. Loyalty.
The bedrock of these groups, like you said.
Exactly.
And their reach, it's pretty extensive now. We're not just talking Texas.
No, they're active across several U.S. states.
Mm.
New Mexico, Arizona. I even saw mentions of Massachusetts and Pennsylvania.
Wow, that far east.
Yeah. And then, of course, the big one is their presence in Mexico, in Chihuahua State, particularly Ciudad Juarez, right across the border from El Paso.
Right. And the numbers, estimates are around, what, 8,000 members total?
Something like that, maybe 3,000 or so in the U.S., and the larger chunk, maybe 5,000 down in Juarez.
That cross-border element just seems absolutely fundamental to how they operate.
Oh, completely. Being able to function on both sides, it gives them a huge strategic advantage.
How so?
Well, they can play the differences in the legal systems, law enforcement priorities in each country, sort of against each other, use it to their advantage for, well, their criminal goals.
Right, makes sense. And speaking of goals, their activities. It's quite the list.
Yeah, it's pretty wide-ranging.
Drug trafficking, human trafficking, which you might expect given the border location.
Sure.
But also arson, murder, assault, car theft, burglary, extortion, intimidation, kidnapping, robbery. It's a sobering list.
It really is. But it does seem like the main moneymaker, the primary source of income, is smuggling drugs from Mexico into the U.S.
And then distributing them, right?
Yeah.
Both on the streets and inside prisons, too.
Exactly. The drug trade, it fuels so many of these groups. The profits are just immense, and that money translates directly into power, influence, weapons, everything they need to keep going.
And in this kind of world, you need allies, but you also make enemies. Who are they aligned with, and who are they fighting against?
Well, key allies seem to be the Juarez Cartel and its armed wing, La Linea. They're basically the muscle for Juarez.
Okay, so a major cartel connection there.
Definitely. And on the other side, their main rivals, Los Mexiles is another powerful gang, and of course, the Sinaloa Cartel.
The big one.
Yeah. And also a group called the Border Brothers. So they're right in the thick of some pretty intense power struggles.
This whole web of alliances and rivalries, it feels like it's constantly shifting.
It absolutely is. That's typical of organized crime. Deals are made, deals are broken. It all depends on, who's strong, who's weak, what the opportunities are.
So Barrio Azteca being allied with Juarez but fighting Sinaloa, that really highlights those complex dynamics.
Perfectly.
Thinking back to their early image, they apparently worked hard to cultivate this reputation for being, well, extremely tough and loyal.
Yeah, sources mention a willingness to commit murder, even kill civilians, just to maintain fear within the ranks and ensure obedience. It's pretty chilling stuff.
Disturbing. And their growth into Mexico, you mentioned Juarez and El Paso, that connection seems vital.
It's crucial. The two cities are so intertwined, families live on both sides, businesses operate across the border, even gangs share members sometimes.
Right. It creates these natural pathways.
Exactly. And there's this detail about undocumented Mexicans maybe joining the gang while imprisoned in Texas.
Hmm.
And then when they're deported or returned to Mexico, they bring that affiliation back with them, boosting the gang's presence there.
That's a really interesting insight into how that expansion might have happened.
Yeah, it shows that cross-border flow.
And that brings us to the Juarez cartel relationship.
Yeah.
You said they were key allies. How did that develop?
Well, initially, it sounds like Barrio Azteca were more like retailers. They sold drugs that the Juarez cartel moved across the border.
Okay, so a standard supplier-dealer relationship.
Pretty much. But as Barrio Azteca got bigger and stronger, the alliance deepened. They started buying directly from the cartel, huge amounts of cocaine, probably at better prices.
And what did they offer in return?
A couple of key things. One was weapons. They'd arrange for straw purchases in Texas, where someone buys guns legally for someone who can't.
Right, and then smuggle them into Mexico.
Exactly. Big demand for U.S. firearms down there.
Yeah.
The other thing was acting as enforcers for the Juarez cartel, but inside the U.S., intimidation, maybe even assassinations.
So it became much more of a two-way street, a symbiotic relationship.
You got it. Juarez gets guns and muscle on both sides of the border. Barrio Azteca gets a steady drug supply and the backing of a major cartel. Mutually beneficial, in a criminal sense.
But that alliance got tested, didn't it? When the Sinaloa cartel tried to move into Juarez. Around 2008.
Yeah, that was a major flashpoint. The Sinaloa cartel made a push for Juarez, which was, the Juarez cartel's home turf.
And naturally, Juarez called on their allies.
They called on Barrio Azteca to defend the territory, and according to Mexican authorities, Barrio Azteca was responsible for a huge amount of the violence that followed, just brutal assassinations.
So they became the frontline soldiers in that turf war.
Essentially, yes. When these big cartels clash, the street gangs often do the dirty work, the most dangerous, fighting for control of those valuable trafficking routes.
And that fight is still going on, it seems. Even by, June 2020, the dynamics had shifted again.
Right. A faction within the Sinaloa cartel, the Los Salazar cell, had become a really significant rival in Juarez, apparently considered almost on par with La Línea, the Juarez cartel's own enforcers.
So the balance of power is just constantly shifting.
Always. The criminal underworld is never stable. New groups rise, alliances break, competition is constant. The fact that a Sinaloa faction could gain that much ground shows how fluid it all is.
Let's talk about the violence itself, specifically the cross-border aspect. They operate on both sides, members have citizenship in both countries, and a lot of the violence happens in Mexico. But there are these really alarming reports about kidnappings in the U.S.
Yeah, kidnapping people in El Paso, then taking them across the border to Juarez to be executed.
Why do that?
The likely thinking is that, a murder in Juarez might get less investigation, less heat than one in El Paso, exploiting those jurisdictional boundaries again.
That's incredibly calculating.
And disturbing.
Deeply disturbing. It leverages those differences in law enforcement capacity and focus.
And the methods. The reports are just horrific. Torture, murder in front of other gang members.
Extreme violence. There was one account describing victims being thrown into pits filled with gasoline and set on fire. God, why such extreme brutality?
It serves multiple purposes, unfortunately. Enforcing loyalty, absolute loyalty within the gang, intimidating rivals, obviously, and just creating this pervasive climate of fear.
So everyone knows not to cross them.
Exactly. And making it public like that, it's a gruesome warning signal to enemies.
We also get a look at the leadership through this guy, Eduardo Ravello.
Yeah.
Former leader, caught in 2018.
Right. God bless. His criminal career goes back to the early 2000s. Faced racketeering, drug conspiracy charges, the works.
Apparently ordered a hit on someone who stole from the Juarez cartel. His faction in Mexico is known as Los Aztecas.
And there was that detail about how much he allegedly paid his hitmen.
Yeah, that was stunning. $40 USD a week.
To carry out assassination.
$40. It speaks volumes about the exploitation, the desperation, the absolute devaluation of human life in that world. Chilling.
And Ravello himself was linked to kidnappings, torture, beheadings, basically ruling through terror. Leaders like him often cultivate that image. Extreme violence maintains control inside the gang and projects this ruthless power outwards. It creates a fear that's hard to break.
That capacity for violence, it really comes through in those prison massacres mentioned in the sources. The first one, 2009.
Yeah, a major clash inside a Juarez prison. Barrio Azteca against Los Mexicles and their allies, Artistas Assassinos, who were linked to Sinaloa.
20 inmates killed from the rival side. And the report said Barrio Azteca members somehow got keys from a guard.
Allegedly stole keys, yeah? Freed their own members and attacked the rivals. Using knives, homemade guns. Just savage.
It shows how prisons themselves become battlegrounds for these gangs.
Absolutely. They're fighting for control even behind bars. And the fact they could supposedly get keys, orchestrate that kind of attack, it suggests, well, serious organization, maybe corruption within the prison too.
And sadly, it wasn't a one-off. There was another massacre in 2011.
Right. Different Juarez prison, but same players, basically. Barrio Azteca attacking Los Mexicles again. 17 dead this time, 20 injured.
And the details there were even more disturbing with surveillance video.
Yeah, the video reportedly showed gunmen clearing guards out of a hallway first, just moving them aside before letting other attackers in to open fire on the rivals.
Which strongly suggests
collusion, corruption, at the very least, incredibly weak security controls. It paints a picture of gangs operating with real impunity inside the prison.
But the violence wasn't contained to prisons. Tragically, it spilled out in horrific ways, like the Villas de Salvarcar massacre in 2010.
Oh, that was awful. Gunmen just stormed a teenage birthday party in Juarez. Killed 16 young people.
Witnesses talked about multiple cars, over 100 AK-47 casings found. Just overwhelming force.
And initially, no one could figure out why. The victims weren't linked to drug trafficking, just kids at a party.
But then a suspect confessed.
Yeah, confessed that the Juarez cartel thought members of a rival gang were at that party. Mistaken identity. And the order was just kill everyone inside.
Unbelievable. A Barrio Azteca leader apparently admitted ordering it for the same mistaken reason. The public outrage must have been immense.
It was huge. A truly senseless tragedy that highlighted the indiscriminate nature of the violence. Innocent civilians caught in the crossfire based on bad information.
And 2010 was just a brutal year. That was also when the U.S. consulate assassinations happened.
Right. A pregnant U.S. consulate employee, her husband, and the husband of another consulate worker, murdered in separate attacks in Juarez.
Evidence pointed toward Barrio Azteca again, ordered by a leader named Arturo Gallegos Castrillon, El Farmero.
And the motive, again, possibly mistaken identity, or a belief they were giving visas to rivals.
Either way, targeting U.S. officials like that was unprecedented, a huge escalation.
A massive deal. First deadly attack on U.S. officials in Mexico caused enormous concern, obviously, about safety, about the potential for miscalculation in the conflict.
It took years, but they eventually figured out it was part of some deal with a former Juarez cartel leader. The last suspect wasn't arrested until 2020.
Shows you how long the shadow of these events can be, and the persistence of law enforcement trying to get accountability.
And 2010 wasn't done yet. There was another massacre, Horizontes del Sur.
Another birthday party, a boy's birthday party this time. Gunmen attacked, killed 14, wounded over 20.
Authorities suspected La Linea and Barrio Azteca, or maybe independent gunmen targeting someone specific from a rival gang. Just a horrifying time in Juarez.
It really paints a picture of a city under siege, celebrations becoming targets, the pervasiveness of the violence, with Barrio Azteca often named as potentially involved.
So how does this group actually function day to day? What's the structure like?
Sources describe it as pretty hierarchical, almost militaristic, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, soldiers, a clear chain of command.
And discipline.
Enforced through violence, both internally against their own members who step out of line and externally against rivals, inside prison and out.
And the money comes mainly from drugs, fueled by that Juarez cartel alliance.
Right, drug sales are central. But they also extort independent dealers in their territories. And they use, apparently, fairly sophisticated communication.
Like what?
Coded language, based partly on Nahuatl, the Aztec language. Contraband cell phones, obviously. Detailed membership lists. Trying to stay ahead of law enforcement.
And their power base seems really rooted in the prisons.
Yeah, that seems key. Power is often concentrated within the prison system, projecting outwards from there.
And we mentioned members crossing the border. Apparently, they often cross legally after committing crimes in Mexico.
Again, exploiting that border fluidity makes it harder to track and apprehend them.
And at their peak, around 2010, some assessments, like from the FBI and El Paso police, actually put them as more powerful in Juarez than Los Zetas.
That's a striking comparison given how notoriously violent the Zetas were. It suggests Barrio Azteca had significant numbers and controlled a lot of smaller affiliated gangs at that time, a major force.
But things have changed somewhat. Law enforcement has had some successes recently.
Definitely. There have been some significant arrests of key leaders in recent years. We mentioned Ravello back in 2018,
Right.
but also guys like Rene Gerardo Santana Garza, L300, also in 2018. And in 2020, Jesus Alfredo Martinez Mendoza, El Freddy, and Jose Dolores Villegas Soto, El Iraqi.
And El Iraqi was also leading La Empresa at the time.
Yeah, which is believed to be an offshoot or allied group. So taking out figures like that definitely disrupts things.
Though it can also lead to more violence, right?
Okay.
Retaliation.
Unfortunately, yes. Arrests can create power vacuums, internal struggles, or trigger revenge attacks. It's often part of the cycle.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive into Barrio Azteca, what are the main takeaways?
Well, I think their story really shows that complex interplay between street gangs, the prison system where they were born, and these powerful drug cartels across the border.
Yeah, their evolution from a prison group to this transnational criminal player allied with Juarez.
Yeah.
It says so much about how organized crime works in that border region. The brutal reality of it all.
And the incidents we talked about, those prison massacres, Viles de Salvarcar, the consulate killings, they just hammer home the extreme violence the gang is capable of and the devastating impact it has on both sides of the border.
It really does.
And what's maybe most striking is how deeply rooted Barrio Azteca is in both the U.S. and Mexico. Their ability to adapt, to make alliances, to operate across that border. It really leads to a big question, I think.
Okay.
So for you listening, considering these deep roots, this adaptability, what do you think the continued presence and the evolution of a group like Barrio Azteca suggests about the long-term challenges, the difficulties in really tackling organized crime effectively in such an interconnected border region,